Mr. Lawson is currently a senior advisor at EY with over 35 years of experience in banking. He has been closely involved in the evolution of Russian banking while CEO of HSBC Russia, and before that, president of Citibank Russia. So as we've already alluded to, you've had quite a lot of experience with crisis management, and now you're lecturing on crisis management. Do you feel like some of the lessons that you learned while doing crisis management have spilled over into your lectures, your teaching?
Yeah, I mean, I've been very fortunate, and I use the word advisedly. I've been very fortunate to participate in some of the worst times of different economies around the world. So, you know, starting in, as I mentioned, in Kenya, I was then used as the crisis manager first in Egypt, then in Norway, then in the UK. I actually created leverage buyouts that blew up. So I created my own crisis, and then I topped it off with a crisis in Italy. And so I've had great opportunity to observe how people react in crisis, to see what actions make sense and what actions don't. I'd make a couple of points up front. The first is every crisis is different. There's a slight danger that you get complacent and you say, oh, I'm a crisis manager, therefore I know how to act. It is true that somebody that goes through this sort of situation more than once gets a sense of the rhythm, as it were, of a crisis. But it's very important to understand that each crisis will have different elements. It is interesting that in most cases, people react in somewhat similar ways when a crisis hits. So the first reaction in a crisis is that people tend to do nothing. It's outside their normal experience. They don't know where to turn. They're looking for leadership. And it's that period, and I call it the rabbit in the headlights. It's at that period where the guy who's able to understand the dynamics and takes action has flexibility that later in the crisis no longer exists. So really one of the first things I'd say is to be a good crisis manager, you actually have to see the crisis coming, because your ability to take proactive actions that will save you in the future, it's at that point in time you have to take those actions. There is clearly a period pre-crisis, post the moment of crisis. Post the moment of crisis, you're in reactive mode. And in reactive mode, there are a number of elements there that you need to bear in mind. The first is past or historic inputs no longer necessarily create the same historic outputs. And so you've got to create new forms of information, and you have to be prepared to take action based on new sources of information, because the old sources may no longer be relevant. The second thing is that you need to take a view, and this is one of the more difficult elements. Liquidity is oxygen, and you're 20 meters down. So in a crisis, the guy who runs out of oxygen loses to the person that still has it. And the liquidity that you create at the front end of a crisis comes from all the sort of cost-cutting measures that you know about. You cut training, you cut hiring, you cut capital expenditure. This is all fine. But if the crisis is short-lived and you have taken action that's really very tough action, and then there's a quick recovery, your competitors will be in a better position than you. Obviously, if it is a long crisis and you've taken urgent action to generate liquidity, then hopefully you're in a position to then dominate the market. And one of the things I'd say about crisis management, that makes it so interesting is that you're not dealing at the edge. You're dealing not in 1% of market share, you're dealing in survival or non-survival. And this makes it a very challenging environment.
It's very interesting. It sounds like you have your own personal case studies, so to speak.
Yeah, no, it's true. I've got plenty of them. And actually, I use them in the class. One of the elements of this that I think is very relevant is to talk about leadership styles. You know, one of the things about being a leader, if you think you're leading but no one's following, you're taking a walk. You're not leading. And leading is about influence, not necessarily power. It's how you create a vision and you have people follow you. But in crisis and urgent change management, you have to switch style. You have to move from coaching style, democratic style that requires time, to a coercive authoritarian style, which is something that requires people to act and maybe act in a way that they don't necessarily agree with. This is very challenging, and you can only use this type of direct management style, leadership, coercion, only for a very short period of time, because people don't enjoy it. It goes against all the basic principles of leadership, which is influence is much more powerful than simply the use of your power as a leader. So I'd say that, you know, a crisis challenges you. It creates opportunities, and if you're a specialist at it, you can use your advantage against the competition at the early stages, which means that you move first, and that is very beneficial.
They try to knock me.